everyone. Welcome to Briar Haus Writes. I'm Becky Parker, and today it is my honor to be able to introduce to you Heather Lende. She's an amazing writer, poet, and she's considered the premier moose hunter, from what I understand. Heather, welcome to our program.
Oh, thanks, Becky. It's nice to be here.
Heather, tell us a little bit about yourself.
That you wouldn't be able to read in any of the bios, I take it. Just
Oh, this is to showcase little known facts about you.
little
That
known
you
fact. Well, obviously, I live in Alaska, and so you know all that part about me. I say a little known fact is probably that I'm a pretty good athlete. That I don't ever write about that, and I wouldn't say that except that now that I'm 65, I'm not as good as I used to be. So it's not braggy, but I ran a 3:08 marathon.
Oh,
I'm a
wow.
softball player, um, cyclist, swimmer, snowshoer. I've got goggle marks from this morning. So I never write about that because I always thought that would be kind of braggy, but that's just something that's most people don't know from my writing.
No, that's just who you are, though. That's
Yeah.
part of it.
Oh, I work out every day. It's a very big part of my day, but I don't write about it very much,
Well, and
if ever.
speaking, well, now you're going to have to because we talked about it today. So, Heather, tell me about the writing. How did you begin to start writing? What led you to maybe delving into it more than just like a third grader who writes for school?
When I moved to Haines, Alaska, when I was 23 or 4 from the East Coast, I got a job at the local radio station. It's a community station, public radio station, serves Haines and Cluckwan and Skagway, about 1,000 people in the listening audience. And I ended up doing a little morning show and consequently doing little slice of life sort of conversational essays. And they were popular and they went statewide and then nationally. And then that led to a column in the Anchorage Daily News and then a book, pretty much. But my writing voice is very much my speaking voice. And that's why I sound the way I do. It's from radio.
You also write a blog,
Mhm.
and so what interests you?
Well, for me, it was interesting. My first book, I, I, I began sort of oddly writing the obituaries for the Chilkat Valley News and our local weekly paper. And I started doing that. And I learned about the community that way and then also kind of became part of it because you were part of all the death rituals. In our community, there's not a funeral parlor. Volunteers prepare bodies. People, play music and bring food for the post-funeral, events, and then someone has to write the obituary or the eulogy to help. And I, for some reason, was able to do that, and I still do it. And so that really influenced my writing. And life and death, it's what you want to write about, and also learning about people's lives because they tell you a lot more about themselves, or their families tell you a lot more about them after they're dead than when they're alive. All kinds of things, good things and bad things, are much more they're just more public after someone passes away. And so that has hugely influenced my writing. And really, all of my books have some of that connection in it. And so my first one, I remember talking to a small publisher in Alaska saying, I've got this great idea for a book. It's sort of a window into a small town from the local obituary writer. I have a couple of these essays. Would you like to hear them? And the woman said to me, wait a minute, you want to write about dead people? And then, well, it's really about life. And I've been on the radio and I think people will really like it. And I have this following. And she said, if every single person in Haines bought it, it would still lose money. Call me when you get in Time magazine. And um, but then an editor in New York heard a piece that I'd done on NPR and called me on the phone and said, would you like to write a book? And I said, I've been waiting for this call my whole life.
As it so happens, I have one
And then
right
she
here.
said, right. And she said, well, let's do your commentaries, your little, and I said, they're okay, but they're short and they're more they're time sensitive. Like they're good at the moment, but I don't think they'd hold up over time reading them. I said, what I really want to write about is this thing I do as an obituary writer. And she said, well, send me something. And then she said, okay, let's do that. And that's how If You Lived Here, I Know Your Name came. And that book went on to be a New York Times bestseller. So I
So did
never
you
did
contact that
it
person
though.
back?
No, I didn't because I'm nice. I mean, I was never in Time magazine, so I
But
didn't.
you could casually just mention it, like hell, But I
Yeah,
was so fascinated to read that you've written over 400 obituaries,
yeah.
and I can't imagine how difficult that could be to condense a life down into just a few, you know, lines. So how difficult has that been, and what's the challenge do you find?
Well, the newspaper, it's formulaic. Is an obituary is formulaic pretty much, and the paper had its own guidelines. So basically, what I begin with is the most recent thing. So, for instance, I just wrote one for a guy named Santa Mike. And Santa Mike was the Santa Claus stand-in for Santa Claus in Haines for 20 years. And
Oh,
so what I said was that there was a memorial service at the Legion for Santa Mike, and that he was buried the next day. And then I talk about people who knew him, what the for instance, one of the we had a natural disaster here, which I'm sure you're familiar in Tennessee,
yes.
and a landslide, and two people were killed, and people were evacuated from homes in 2020. And during that, Santa Mike went to the Legion Hall, which was where people were evacuated to, in his suit and everything, and assured children who were um, not going to be able to go home for Christmas that Santa would still find them.
Oh,
And I just thought that was enough. You didn't have to go into all the other stuff about him, but that was the kind of person he was. And so it's a sketch, it's not everything. There were many other stories that were told, there were many things, but I try to sort of get to something that also someone reading it that might not even know him will think about and perhaps be kinder, more generous, more thoughtful as a result of that. Or even in some cases, read something about maybe someone that was estranged from their family, and a son saying, I didn't know my dad at all because he never really talked to us, but I guess
mhm.
they liked him at work or something. Maybe read that and think, maybe I need to reach out to some people and maybe mend some fences before it's too late. So I try to have things in them that capture the person, but that also share a universal truth, which is, I think, what I do in my stories that are very specific about a small town and real people,
Mhm.
but resonate just maybe because my eyes and ears are thinking that way. Like,
You're more
and
attuned to it.
yeah, and I think part of it came from when I was in Alaska. I was writing letters to my mother. This is all pre, email and internet and Zoom.
Mhm.
And and I, would try to explain to her, tell her things that were happening here and things, the kind of thing that, it's like, Mom, you wouldn't believe what I heard today or who I met and what they did. And that's just the way my brain works. And so I do the same thing. I've always done the same thing now in all of my books. Like, this is just astonishing that this is going on all around us. And I actually thought, even when I wrote the first book about Haynes, I had the librarian, proofread it. And she's like, I had no idea. And I thought, are you kidding me? Doesn't everybody know all this? And I was so surprised that the things that I see at an event, or the connections that I make to things, not everybody does. And I don't know where that comes from. And I don't know if it's so much writing as it is just the way I see the world and then share what I see or feel.
But could it be that that line that says you can't see the forest for the trees sometimes, if you're in it and then you really can't see, but maybe God's given you this ability to be able to really get down there and see things that other people would really can't see until
Yeah, I
you
don't know.
put it down. You never know.
I think too, I think from writing obituaries too, I have a tremendous, probably too much, probably to a fault. I'm empathetic. And so I'm always trying to like read a room and see why is that person so angry, or what's going on here? There's someone sitting here at the library meeting and they just really snapped for no particular reason. There's more to it. And
Hmm.
then sort of finding out, oh, right, they've got a special needs son who's sick, and the clinic is closed and their mom has just moved in with them. And, there's stuff happening. And then they got a flat tire on the way over there. Like it has
Yeah.
nothing to do with the person that they just snapped at. And reminding myself to be, um, re refrain from judging until a little bit about what's happening. And then I try to find out. I think what I am, and this has come up before, and now that I'm like, I don't know, I've been doing this for a long time, and I'm a grandmother. I have 12 grandchildren. I'm more confident in what I used to think was just weird how I saw the world, or where did it come from? I didn't know, or was it all connected? And now I see it as all connected, and I see in lots of ways the biggest benefit I think I've been to the world or to my community or the state is I'm kind of like a grief counselor. People read things and they feel differently about grief. And I just never really connected that until I part of one of the organizations I belong to is Hospice of Haynes here, and I do bedside hospice care, and
Mhm.
we had a big grief workshop, and I'm like, that's what I do. Like that's the grief counseling is
It's
really what I do when you're writing an obituary.
yeah, because people that are going to be reading that and it's going to impact them one way or the other.
Well,
Um,
and also I talk to all the family members. I'm sitting around a kitchen table and right when it's happened, because again, without a funeral parlor, there's not cremation. I mean, bodies have to be buried in 3 days. So this is all very quick when it happens. You're right there. And sometimes it's a sudden death. Sometimes they've been dying at home for a while, but it's still always pretty traumatic when you step into a house right after that's happened. And how you bring some comfort.
well, and speaking of traumatic, in 2020, the world endured a tremendous trauma, and
Mhm.
you began a writing series um, where you did a video of each chapter of your book, Take Good Care of the Garden and the Dogs.
Oh,
Can
I'm
you
so
tell us?
happy that you saw that.
So, can you tell us about that?
Well, what happened was, COVID happened. And for us, it was really interesting because we had a granddaughter that was born in Australia on January 7th, 2020. And so I'm not a world traveler. I never go. We made this big trip to go see her. So we were in Australia. Then on the way home, we were there a month. And on the way home, it was end of February or so. And like COVID was coming, like behind us on the plane, practically, it felt like that. And, we landed in Hawaii and it was like first cases of the coronavirus. And it's like, but suddenly there was masks on the plane. Then boom, we landed in Juneau and my another daughter was having a baby in Juneau. And I stayed with her until the baby was born on March 16th. And so I went in the hospital. I cut little Amelia's umbilical cord. And the next day, I wasn't allowed in the hospital and I wasn't allowed to go back to my daughter's house to even stay there. I had to stay in the housing at the hospital and take a plane home. And I didn't see that baby for another 9 months.
No.
Um, and so it was, yeah, tremendously. I was just completely wigged out, like a lot of us were. Like, what just happened? Um, and I thought, well, I wrote a book about, what can I do? I'm home alone, and I wrote this book about the hard time in my life. And I thought maybe I should just read it. And I called my publisher and said, "Am I allowed to? Is that like if I'm not selling?" And she's, "Sure, it's yours. You can do whatever you want." And I had in my house a little video set up that was for Hospice of Haynes, where we interviewed elders. The high school kids would interview elders to tell their stories. And there was this kit, and I had one of the kits that was dropped off at my house by a kid before all this happened. So I was like, I've got this kit. Maybe I can learn how to use it. And there's a microphone, there's a thing. I read the instructions. And I did it. And I did it. I decided to read a chapter every day for the first. I thought it would be over by then, but just to maybe keep people company. And I was also inspired by Mary Chapin Carpenter, who's a singer that I'm fond of, and she was doing that from her home. She was doing a song every day. And she has a dog that looks just like my dog. And I thought, well, she can do it. And she's Mary Chapin Carpenter. I can certainly do it. So I did, and I loved it. I was very proud of it and very happy that I'd done it. And I got mail from all over. There were emergency room nurses in New York City that were watching it when they got off work because they just needed something different than what was in the news. So that made me really happy.
I'm glad because that was such a hard time. It still is for some who are dealing with long-term COVID. And so I just love the fact that you did that. And I want to thank you for doing that.
I was just going to
Yeah.
say though, it's interesting because some people say, "Well, why don't you charge for it?" Or why? And it's like, charge for it. People can buy my books. They can go get them at a library. I think as a writer, I'm just so happy people are interested in the story, and that I'm doing something valuable with what I know how to do. And so it made me feel really good. And I mean, not to be too corny, but it's priceless, to have to connect with people that I don't know with my words from my kitchen in Haines, Alaska, all over the place, and telling these fairly pretty personal stories, like to strangers, and trusting that it's landing and knowing that it does. It's a I don't know, it's just a wonderful thing to be so connected that way.
Well, and I think the fact that, it wasn't a shelter in place order and you feel so isolated, Zoom and YouTube really gave people a chance to broaden their
Mhm.
horizons in a way that may never have occurred.
Mhm.
So something good could come out of something so tragic.
Yep.
I think it's really cool. Well, tell us about how you became Writer Laureate for Alaska.
Well, that was kooky too because it was also it was Zoom. I mean it was COVID Zoom 20. I did everything on Zoom. It was my appointment was in 2020. And so it's now 2024 and I'm passing the baton here next week. It was supposed to be 2 years, but because everything during COVID, so it was really weird. I had this big honor that came kind of out of the blue. I got a phone call, would you like to do it? I said, of course. What does that mean? Well, it was supposed to mean a lot of travel, doing things. Well, you're not going to travel because you're that. It was supposed to mean going to big, banquets and getting a little tiara that you're the writer laureate. Well, that never happened either. I was just like at home. Okay, I'm the writer laureate. But then, but the most interesting thing again was, like you say, connecting to places via Zoom. And I learned actually a lot of when you get these kind of honors, you go to different communities
Mhm.
and the literati, the arts people have you, and it's a nice hotel or a something where you're there, a really nice library where the friends of the library have a special, you know, tea and thing. And it's kind of it's not, I wouldn't say it's elitist, but it kind of, there's tickets and it's a Friday night at certain hours or whatever. And that has been my experience with sort of traveling artists or a writer laureate or whatever the title is. But because we couldn't do that, I actually got to connect with a lot more people that normally would never be able to go see the writer laureate. Like I was in community called Bethel outside of Alaska is so big, it's hard to even understand how big it is, but it's huge. It's another part of the country, part of the state where even if I'd traveled there, it would have been a big deal and it would have been a very, certain group of people that would be able to see and cost a lot of money and all that stuff. And instead, I'm on Zoom. And so there's like a mom watching me where she's got like a baby on her hip. There's her grandpa sleeping on the couch. It's all during Zoom. I can see in the background all the people. And she would never have even been able to go out that night to go to the event. And I got to talk with her. Another one that was really funny was a group that were on the Alaska Highway, a community on the Alaska Highway that, again, I visited via Zoom. And when I'm talking and looking at all the screens, and in the background, everybody is freezing vegetables or canning things. There's this whole, and I was like, what is going on? There's people making applesauce. And they said, "Oh gosh, good thing you didn't come tonight because a tractor trailer with produce on its way to Anchorage went off the road, icy road, and it's all going to freeze by the morning. So they just said we could all come and get it." And so they were all getting
Wow.
broccoli. They're all blanching broccoli for the freezer. Alaskans getting vegetables in the winter, especially rural Alaskans. This is a big
Pretty
thing.
cool.
But they said nobody would have come because we were all
Busy.
salvaging what was in the back of this truck. And so that was anyway, it made a big difference. And I got to meet a lot of people and hear stories that I don't think many people who are in that position usually do. And the biggest thing that came out of my tenure there was just understanding um, the historic, really the historical trauma of Alaskan natives and my neighbors that I'd written obituaries. I know Haynes is a quarter Tlingit and native, but when you actually are talking to people, or even people who are writers that have been told, well, their story isn't really what you want to do, and you're not writing it quite right, or
Mhm.
using the language differently. I just, it's like I thought I knew, but I didn't, and I don't think I would have understood that if I had only been the visiting bigwig in the room. But
Right.
when you're on smaller conversations with smaller groups and invited via Zoom, a lot of things I learned were really heartbreaking, and it changed my even sort of my focus of what to talk about. And the next writer laureate is a Native woman who's a writer for television, Molly of Denali, and she wrote for Alaska Daily too. So I'm really happy about that.
That'll be interesting to see how she does
Mhm.
in her
Yeah.
tenure. I'll be
Mhm.
curious to see how that turns out.
Yeah.
Heather, can you read for us your work?
Sure, I can read a little bit for you. I wanted to, I don't know, I wanted to read a little bit because it is the sort of political season. Bears and Ballots is my most recent book. It's about my time on the Borough Assembly in Haines, which is our government here. For some reason, they call counties in Alaska called boroughs, and we have a mayor. And but I thought I'd read one little thing because it seems to fit in with what's happening in the world right now. And in it, I'm talking about a couple of people that were on the assembly that had a kind of a performance gene. And so I say, Tresham and Julie have the performance gene. I do too, though it reveals itself in writing more than public speaking. I suspect most people who run for office have one. We would rather be on the dais than in the audience. But this trait is not one that necessarily leads to good governing. In this way, some political problems are biological. It's the nature of humans who are attracted to the political process, as well as some of those who report on it, to shout, "Look at me, look how clever I am." But it's not hopeless. The thing DNA tests don't reveal, and why even identical twins don't think and feel the same, is the nurture part. We can put ourselves in environments in which we develop new skills. People who are used to watching and observing the theater of politics can learn to be the decision makers, and the decision makers can learn to listen and compromise. From the beginning, as activist Parker Palmer writes, democracy has been a nonstop experiment in the strength and weakness of the system. Our form of government is just that, a guideline, the rules we collectively agree to live by. It's the people involved in it who make it work or not. Native American civil rights activist Elizabeth Peradovich said as much when she told the Alaska legislature in 1945 that racial segregation may be the law, but it was not right, and convinced them to change it. So much depends on people of goodwill, and they are everywhere. This is from Find the Good. These are short pieces about things I learned writing obituaries. Clyde Bell said hello to me every time he spotted me walking by, sometimes even coming out of his seafood store and crossing the street. I never said goodbye. It's hard to believe he won't be stepping out on the porch of his shop with a house Heather today. And before I can reply, telling me that what I should be writing about for that paper. This is when I had a column in the Anchorage Daily News. Listen, gal, he'd say, and wonder if I saw the colorful sunset last night and what was I going to tell people about it. And didn't I know it wasn't natural to have colored contrails or exhaust fumes behind airplanes? Those odd red and purple clouds were produced by military jets covertly spreading chemtrails laced with heavy metals. Clyde believed the federal government was salting the clouds to alter the jet stream in order to change tundra into wheat producing prairie because bread would be the new oil when everything goes to hell down south. Clyde could be found most days smoking a cigarette and nursing a can of Ham's beer at Bell's Seafood, which is in the former town jail adjacent to Bell's store, where his wife Doris sells sundries and flowers. Bell's Seafood has a rusty potbelly wood stove by the door with a stack of firewood on the floor nearby, two aging glass front cases, one with frozen fish, one with fresh, and some big chest freezers in the back room. The presentation is not the most beautiful, but the product is good. A lot like Clyde, actually. He was lean, freckled, and had a boyish yet weathered face. If he wasn't in the store, there was a note on the window to see Doris next door if you needed fish. That meant he was at the harbor buying more, or cruising around town with his three-legged dog in the passenger seat of a pickup, plastered with paper signs advertising his latest special: king crab legs, fresh halibut. When I heard Clyde had been medevaced to the hospital, I figured he'd be back soon. He died a day later in Anchorage, organ failure. He was 60. Doris said she knew Clyde was seriously ill, and so did he, but he didn't want to leave town. His brother-in-law, church elder and former volunteer fire chief Rock Aarons, said that a few days before, Clyde had confessed he didn't think anyone would miss him. It's true that Clyde had a prickly side, but did he really not know the size of the crater his falling star would make when it finally hit the ground and flamed out? He should have attended his memorial service at the American Legion Hall. There were not enough chairs. More people stood out on the sidewalk. One friend reminded us that when Johnny Cash died, the renter in the apartment above Clyde's store blared Cash songs out the window for 24 hours. When Main Street neighbors complained, Clyde marched upstairs, turned the music even louder, and sat on the couch and listened to those songs until tears streamed down his face. Hanging out with Clyde, another friend said, was a lot like listening to a good country song. He was always sad, and he was always laughing. That essay goes on a little longer, but I didn't want to overstay my welcome.
You could never do that, Heather. But I want to thank you so much for spending time with us today at Briar House Writes. Can you tell people before we leave where they can find your work and your blog?
Yes, really, hopefully at your library, at any libraries. I'm a big library supporter, so try that. Also, most bookstores you can order it. Of course, you can get it on the big one, but I prefer you to shop at your local independent store. And my blog is at heatherlende.com. If you just Google my name, it's easy to find. And website, you can see lots of pictures, and it's free, and you can see that video if you'd like. And I'm easy to find. And also, I mean, I'm happy to talk to book clubs or groups, and I do it all the time on Zoom, and that doesn't cost anything either. So if you want to visit with me or your group does, I'm more than happy to do that if we can figure out how the time works. So
And also be sure and check Heather out on YouTube because she's got some great videos there as well. Well, Heather, thank you again. I hope you have a great rest of the day.
thank you very much, Becky.